thrilled to introduce our guests for this evening. Harmon Siegel is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. His writing has appeared in publications such as the Art Bulletin, Art Forum, and American Art. Harmon is joined tonight with WJT Mitchell. Mitchell is a Gaylord Donnelly Distinguished Service Professor of English Language, Literature, and Art History at UChicago. Mitchell served as the longtime editor of Critical Inquiry and is author of many books, including Image Science and What Do Pictures Want? Please help me give a warm welcome to Harmon Siegel and WJT Mitchell.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's like a dream come true to be here. I'm going to read like 2 or 3 pages, and then I'm going to show you some pictures, and then we'll just talk. So, around 1914, Claude Monet's dealer brought him a mysterious painting. It depicted a duck pond in vibrant colors, painted in the artist's signature style. The dealer wanted to know whether Monet had painted it. Yes, the artist replied. He remembered painting something very much like it 40 years ago at a pond near his house in Argenteuil. But, he added, Pierre-Auguste Renoir had been there too, seated alongside him. The 2 artists had worked shoulder to shoulder, portraying the same view. Perhaps this work was his. The dealer then took it to Renoir, but he was equally puzzled, equally uncertain. The mystery was solved to everyone's satisfaction only once Monet dug out a second painting of the same view, which was signed and dated to 1873. If he had painted that one, then the other must be his friend's. To prevent further confusion, Renoir added his name to the unsigned work. So this story seems to prove how strictly the Impressionists adhered to Monet's motto, paint what you really see. It was more than a motto. It was a command, an obligation, a commitment to reproduce nature without interpretation or arrangement. It was an ethical rejoinder to the presumptuous idea that nature was deficient and the hubristic belief that artists could correct it. Monet proclaimed he had never done otherwise. On his first day in art school, when his bewildered master, scrutinizing the young man's drawing of a nude, had proclaimed the feet too big, Monet shrugged, I can draw only what I see. No wonder, then, that 41 years after he had painted the pond with Renoir, Monet could not tell who had authored it. If he and Renoir had done their jobs right, then the paintings should not show Monet's pond or Renoir's pond, but simply the pond, the real one, common to both men. In this account, the Impressionists practiced a form of realism. Paint what you really see. Not what you've learned in art school, not what you want, some idyllic scene, not what you feel, your deepest emotions, but just what you see. They were, as Henry James wrote, partisans of unadorned reality, believing that a proper field of painting is simply the actual and to give a vivid impression of how a thing happens to look. They sought the world as she is, superb and real, without arrangement, without falsification of her feature and her flesh. Its maxim heard this way, Impressionism entailed an impersonal approach that demanded the artist's neutrality vis-a-vis his frank, just the facts fidelity to the absolute reality of things, a quasi-mechanical registration of everyday life in the modern city. Monet is only an eye, grunted Paul Cézanne, but what an eye? They sought, in other words, to render the world as objectively as possible, to show reality as it really is. This argument, however, prompted an immediate retort, for there was another way to hear the same imperative, equally valid. Not paint what you really see, but paint what you really see. Not what I see, not what we see, not what one sees, but what you see. Its maxim heard this way, Impressionism was cast as an art of personal experience, the painting of how things look to a given subject. To convey their individual personalities, the artist should not merely paint their objects, but also communicate their most intimate and private way of seeing the world. If art was, as novelist Émile Zola insisted, a corner of the world seen through temperament, then the more unflinching, the more unique, The more personal the artwork, the better it would be. They sought, in other words, to render experience subjectively, to show things not in themselves, but as they appear within the matrix of perception. If we hear Monet's motto as paint what you really see, then his inability to tell whether he or Renoir had painted the pond made that work an indisputable success. But if we hear it as paint what you really see, then it was just as indisputably a failure. For in the latter doctrine, what mattered above all was that Monet saw and expressed the world differently than Renoir did, that each man's work embodied his personality. In that case, what did it mean? That Monet and Renoir could each look at the same painting and not know which of them had painted it. When paintings stand in for their makers, an artist who fails to recognize his work fails to recognize himself. But it's not quite right to say that Monet and Renoir did not recognize their works. Rather, what each faced in the painting was not himself, not Monet, not Renoir, but their relationship. If each saw the pond through the lens of temperament, that temperament was not merely individual, but relational. Their works were impression of the world, not as it looked to one man, nor to no one in particular, but of how it appeared when seen alongside a friend. The paintings were neither personal nor impersonal, but thoroughly interpersonal. So the book as a whole looks at works like this one, works painted side by side, Monet and another artist. This is a painting by Monet of his daughter-in-law, Blanche, painting alongside another artist. Gives you a sense of what the practice would have looked like. I start with, on the right, Monet's very first painting. She did alongside his teacher, Boudin. Then work he did alongside his next teacher, Duncan. Probably the most famous of the works, which he did alongside Renoir. And what's so interesting about these to me is the way that the artists' styles converge in ways that are very uncharacteristic of them. So, this on the left is Renoir, and he never paints like that again. He never paints like that. Until then, he never paints like that again. There's very clearly a kind of attempt to meld perceptions as proxied by style. Monet and Sisley also. And then Monet being painted by Monet. And as you can see, the painting on the easel represents the scene at the top left, which Monet painted. There are other characters, like Monet painting alongside Renoir. These are both two views of the Monet family. Monet's on the right, which shows Monet tending his garden, and then his wife and child lying in the garden. Or this one of on the right, that's Renoir's portrait of Monet's best friend Basile, painting that heron. That's the heron he was painting. He painted it alongside Sisley. And on the background behind him is a Monet painting. Or Morizot, painting of her niece. On the wall behind her is a photograph of herself and her daughter, who was depicting the same scene alongside her. So the book interprets these paintings through a series of lenses, one set per chapter and one topic: composition, beholding, originality, individuality, society, perspective, and ultimately a kind of humanist case for the continued relevance of Impressionism.
So I'm going to pose a bunch of questions to Harmon, but first I just want to say a couple things about my reaction to this book, which I've been immersed in for a couple of weeks. First, buy it. It's beautiful. It really is just luscious, and I want the name of the designer who did the layout, because this is what you get to see. These juxtapositions that are just startling. And the only kind of juxtapositions I didn't see that I might have wanted was to see repainting something, where you did it once and you said, no, that's not it, and you did it over. But the conversation between artists is really made so visible here. The second thing I want to say about the book is it strikes me as, while immersed in what is arguably the very beating heart of art history. That is the Impressionist movement in France in the 19th century. Michael Fried says on the back cover, this is a very hard subject to be original about. How can you say anything new about Impressionism? And I'm sure you'd agree, the idea, you've repeated, just paint what you see, or paint what you see, as the kind of dialectic of the debate over Impressionism. Is it subjective? Is it objective? Are they trying to produce a shared reality, or is each of them trying to show their individuality as distinct from the others? Your opening anecdote shows just how tricky and difficult that is, that both poles continually assert themselves, and they are in contradiction with one another. So, very hard to be original about Impressionism, which has such a saturated history and critical reception. But Harmon has done it. And not only for this, I want to talk a little bit about method, how you did it, and to what extent you could transfer this method to other avant-gardes. I think, for instance, of a picture of two artists working together that I've recently seen. That's Nam June Paik and John Cage. And in the picture, Nam June Paik is cutting off John Cage's tie and covering him with shaving cream. Is this an act of collaboration, of not painting together but performing together, and performance art being always collaborative in this way? And does it have something to do with avant-gardes? And the way avant-gardes are always little societies, intimate societies. And certainly Impressionism, in some ways, it might be regarded as the first avant-garde. And then there's finally, and this follows from what I've just said, the question of modernity in this book. I love the way it plays on two different versions of modernity. One is, I think, all familiar to us who've read Karl Marx, Freud, Zola, the kind of social conditions of the 19th century, emergence of capitalism, of secularism, liberalism, industrialization, alienation, the whole story of modernity. And yet this is, it doesn't lean on that kind of thing very heavily. A lot of art history tends to do that, immediately leap to the big social picture, and then treat the artwork as an allegory of that. But this treats what I would call something like intimate social history as its real subject matter, taking you into day-to-day, person-to-person, intimate accounts that are charged with competition, love, sharing, anger, all the relations people can have in an incredibly carefully woven fabric. In some way, it's an impression of Impressionism. It really, it felt to me like so much deeper than any of the usual kind of social generalizations, political generalizations that then get allegorized by artworks. But, okay, a question. I kept thinking about how a modern neuroscientist or computer scientist might look at your argument. Not that I'm one of those, but I imagine the neuroscientists say, well, of course they painted what they saw because they were treating themselves, as Monet himself said, as if they had just recovered from blindness. And this is the first impression. This is the onset of color before outline, of what Locke would call secondary qualities before primary qualities. And this is something that was studied in the 18th century. Bishop Berkeley wrote about people who had their eyesight restored after long periods of blindness. And they could only see, their eyesight was blurry. They couldn't make out distinct features or only vaguely. Main thing they saw was an avalanche of color coming at them. So how does that kind of contemporary way, although it was already well known in the 18th century, how does that way of seeing what the Impressionists were doing sort with what you're saying?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'll start with the neurobiologist. And I wish I could do the Woody Allen thing of, I happen to have her right here. Because I did have this amazing conversation with a woman who, she studies macaques and social behavior in macaques. And she was describing what she was characterizing as a failed experiment, where they were trying to test some behavior and they had to control for the visual stimuli. They're seeing the same visual stimuli, they're experiencing it. But the experiment, was a failure because it turns out that there was no common visual stimuli, that the stimulus changed when they were in social conditions and when they were not. So, even the macaques literally at the neurobiological level saw things differently in a kind of social relationship. I don't lean too heavily into this kind of argument, which I'm often a little suspicious of. But I think what makes that kind of research so interesting is not necessarily that it tells us something new, but that it gives us this kind of wonderful, strange way of experiencing what we all experience all the time, right? Which is that if you've watched a movie a million times and then you watch it with a new person, you start noticing new things, seeing new details because you're almost imaginatively seeing it as your friend would see it. So I hope that the neurobiologist would say, yes, exactly, we're doing the same thing. Although she did point out that mine isn't a controlled experiment. But you can't have everything in life. The connection to empiricism is, absolutely right on. The word impression in Impressionism is thought to come through a series of intermediary steps from law. The most consequential definition of Impressionism when it first arises is they're impressionists because they don't paint the landscape, they paint the sensation the landscape makes on them. And the critic who expressed this, that's the very famous phrase. What he goes on to say is that this is a fundamentally subjective way of responding to the world, and as such, it runs the risk of devolving into a kind of solipsistic fantasy. So if you are true only to your impressions, and your impressions are different than anybody else's, and we know they're different because they're all registering their impressions, and they're registering them of the same object differently, okay, so you can draw these kind of deductive steps. Well then, what they're proving is that we all inhabit some kind of solipsistic individual fantasy land that we can't transcend. So that's, in a certain way, one of the kind of arguments at the core of the book is that the practice of painting together is a demonstration of how we do not live in these kinds of solipsistic, walled-off minds, but how we participate in a common social project.
Okay, but when you compare two scenes, two views of the same scene, is it, I don't want to quibble too much about language here, but what are you saying when you say, well, they are seeing the same thing? The impressions look different. The paintings, the only evidence we have of what they saw is the painting.
Yeah.
There's nothing, there's no other, they don't have a camera inside their head to see how the optic nerve was being stimulated. So, and even your opening example, it looks as if that is the closest we come to something where the artist himself couldn't say, whose impression was that? Was it mine or Renoir's? Not until he finds the signature and also finds the missing painting, can he determine that? So, isn't each of them in his own, registering his own impact on the retina, even though the forms are the same? The primary qualities are there. I mean, we know it's water, land, trees,
Yeah.
so forth. We can name things.
Well, I definitely want to start by saying that, this is their rhetorical view of what they're doing is they're registering their impressions. Of course, at the level of historical, if you're looking at the paintings, they're not, one-to-one transcriptions of some actual site. But it is important to engage them on their own terms in this kind of rhetoric of I copy what I see. The point that I want to make about the sort of recovery of the initial impression, if that's what it is precisely that there is no neutral, impersonal view from nowhere, that there are two different impressions of, but that it's a registration of the fact that we're always experiencing the world socially. We're never experiencing the world Robinson Crusoe-like. And so this particular practice is a way of trying to engage that particular aspect of the way that we go about the world, that it's always fundamentally and inexorably social.
So one of the things about Monet's method, if that's what you can call it, early on, if I'm following your narrative, he struggled to find out what it was he was doing. He started as a caricaturist, of all things, which seems completely antithetical to this. And that's why he says, I wish I had been born blind so that I could see the world freshly, as if it was just revealed. By the end of the book, and your conclusion, I think that's where he realizes that he's accomplished that desire in some way, and with the help of his friends, they have managed to create a movement, a collective style, not just an individual style that's his alone. But he feels somewhat trapped in it, as if, okay, I've invented a machine for making art, and I'm like laboring at the mill, churning them out. This is why the other question I wanted to ask you, any day now, well, probably already, a chat GPT or some other artificial intelligence will say, take your photograph and turn it into a Monet. There's a way of simulating style, right down to the look of impasto and brushstrokes. What is this? I mean, in a way, it's a kind of tragic story. Yeah, we did it. We created a style. We won. Look at what we accomplished. And now, are we trapped? So, what's your comment on that?
What's my comment on that? Well, my inclination is to say that the idea of style that is at stake when you say to, large language model, make me a Monet, is a notion of style that comes out of these guys. There's not some pre-existing notion that all artists have a unique individual style, which is conveyed not only in their choice of subject matter, but down to the very, the very gesture. This is an idea that is fundamentally tied to the rise of this kind of avant-garde movement, an idea that painters have to be original. They have to be unique and singular and individual. And this is related to, political questions of liberal individualism and the way that that's experienced in daily life in terms of one's own particularity and individuality. So the notion of style that's at play when you give the instruction to the bot, I think, is already sort of entangled with this history. And it can do a very good job within that notion of style. Does that constitute something like the failure of this project or its success? That I don't know.
Or a kind of melancholy that is associated with it, because Monet's late remarks on how he feels like he's become a bit of a machine himself. And Manet's response, this is the other, you have to read all the way to the end to get this, because there's an arc to this book which I find quite moving, of, a struggle, conquest, victory, and then the aftermath. And when Manet, and he sort of, he's not able to paint his wife's face. And there he is, he starts as a caricaturist, and yet at the end, he's really having difficulty conveying facial expression at all. The faces, he has to veil. So he paints a veil over the face. And you look at Manet sort of at the same time, working from some of the same premises, but transferring it to facial expression, which is, and you make the distinction very, very important between knowing what you're painting, knowing the thing, and acknowledging it. And that I take it that Manet is on the side of acknowledgement. That is, he's trying to convey the soul of the sitter, which can't be seen as a first impression or a secondary quality. It has to do something else.
Yeah.
So this is what I think is the pathos of the story you're telling about Monet, which is another, I don't know if anybody's ever told this story this way, but it strikes me as, it's one of the things that makes this book feel like an important new narrative of Impressionism, not just analyzing some paintings and making sense of it.
Well, the story about painting his wife's corpse is a much repeated and important one. Zola fictionalizes it in one of his novels. And the story goes, strangely enough, Monet was close friends from childhood with Georges Clemenceau, and they're having a correspondence, and Clemenceau says to him something like, we don't see things the same way. You're amazing, I see a tree and I just see a tree, and you see a tree and you see thousands of individual shades of luminosities and browns and greens and so on. And Monet writes back, you don't know how right you are. When the woman I loved more than anyone in the world died and her body was in front of me, before I could reflect on her meaning to me, my body trembled with some kind of reflexive, automatic reaction, and I began to see her as shades of blue and pink and so on. And he ends the letter by saying, thus the beast turns his wheel. This is the mechanism thing. Pity me. What's interesting about that encounter, I think, is that this reception of Impressionism as being somehow inhuman or monstrous didn't need this anecdote to happen. That already from Monet's early debut, critics were seeing his work and saying something like, Zola, when he posed for a portrait for Monet, says, I got the sense that I was to him no more interesting or important than the gray on the wall behind. And this is a remark that becomes incredibly a kind of critical cliche repeated over and over about the Impressionists paint vegetables and people the same way. So my argument about it is that Monet recoils from this in his own practice, and he seeks kind of pictorial means of reaffirming his acknowledgement of the sitter, and that his recoiling from this is part of that enduring mystery of why Monet never became an Impressionist, never joined the group officially. But I also think that he was looking for acknowledgement in the wrong place, because with Monet and the Impressionists, the acknowledgement isn't this kind of z-axis relationship between the painter and the sitter, but this x-axis relationship between the painter and the painter sitting next to him. So that the form of acknowledgement is actually in my responsiveness to you, if we're painting the same thing, our having to converge and diverge and struggle and reconcile and so on. So the acknowledgement is there, and the Impressionist was not a monster, I don't think. But they were not a monster in a specific way.
Okay. Well, I want to open this up to the audience pretty soon here. Maybe one tiny question. Most of my training in art history, which is really skippy, I'm an English professor, moonlights as an art historian. So as an English professor, I studied English painting all the time, and I keep thinking, did the French know about Constable and Turner? Did they know that secondary qualities had already been seen and that you could paint with soap suds and whitewash and make line and form disappear in the mist? They, they don't appear anywhere. Is it because they're on the other side of the channel and so they can't be painting side by side? It's a different kind of adjacency.
There were some people in that circle who did paint side by side. I haven't found any evidence that Constable or Turner did, but people, in their milieu, yeah, the Impressionists were aware of them, knew about them. But I think that the specifics of why this practice mattered for them matter in this very particular French context, this very particular development, and questions that bind artistic histories and social histories.
And this will be my last question. You use the word pilgrimage at one point in the book, and I get the feeling reading it that it's the product of a pilgrimage to not one but many shrines, often in search of very specific places and views. Like you had to go there, how conscious were you of that? I mean, art historians, the art historians I know usually work in museums. They look at paintings that are hung on walls. You went, your sense of local texture is so saturated in this book. It feels like you have retraced their steps. To what extent is that true?
It's true, and there is a giant tourism industry in Paris and the surrounding areas of, in the footsteps of Monet, etc. And they're currently in big renovations, so that you're following in the footsteps in 2026 will be incredible. It goes along. I look at Martha Ward because we've talked about this, but there's a long sort of tradition among people who study Impressionism of going to the sites and often even photographing the sites and including the photographs in the book as some kind of recourse to that impersonal, third-personal view from nowhere sort of thing. Well, okay, here's the photograph and here's the Cézanne, and so we can compare the real thing and the painted thing. And I think that response is really solicited by the paintings, by the way that they are responsive to the particularities of place and what you call local texture. You wouldn't look at a Cubist painting necessarily and try and find the place where Picasso was sitting, or a fauve landscape, and try and find the place that Matisse was, although people do try and do that. But I think there's something very particular about the way that place functions, not only biographically in these artists' lives, but formally, materially, the way that it shows up in the composition of the painting that makes going to the place and looking and trying imagining yourself in there. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think calling it the tourist industry undersells. I think this was a pilgrimage. It went beyond tourism. I also, I was recently in London visiting an artist's studio, and the artist had a seminar with his staff, and both the white-collar workers upstairs and the ones who do the welding and carving and melting downstairs, and had a seminar with them, which, because I was reading your book at the same time, I felt like something's going on here. It has to do with not exactly studio practice, but when artists are at work, there's this solitary model, which is very romantic and probably rarely true. And then there's this collaborative model where it isn't just that you're comparing and contrasting or looking, but you're in quest of a common problem. You're trying to figure something out. And that's what I saw at this seminar. people looking at works and talking about, you know, what are we trying to do here? And the artist sort of leading the discussion, but one thing he kept insisting on, I don't want to know. I don't want to be too sure of everything. This is experimentation. We're finding stuff out. And it reminded me of the kind of thing that scientists do when they are working together. That there was something actually scientific about this. That they really thought, we're trying to get at some truths. And it's a job. It's a work that involves comparing, contrasting, but also collaborating and verbalizing what the problem is. What is it we're trying to get at? So this is another thing. It felt to me like some of the lessons of this book might be generalizable. This goes back to my first lesson about a kind of intimate social history of an avant-garde. Do you see this as a way of working that you could take to other avant-garde movements or other styles and explore it in a similar way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, not, again, painting side by side.
It's the next book.
But I think, you know, one of the points I try and make in the beginning is that the social history of Impressionism is, as you say, very bound up with these kind of large-scale questions about capitalism and demography, urbanism, industrial transformation, and so on. And our kind of analytic paradigm for talking about those things comes out of 19th century social science, alienation, enemy, estrangement, and so on. And this is all true. But the thing about modern life is that we continue to have personal relationships, and the more anonymous our urban city-dwelling lives are, the more we actually demand of our personal relationships. That we can form these kinds of uniquely modern pathologies of failing to recognize, or failing in intimacy, or feeling as though we have failed to be recognized for the people that we are. And so I think to come at that counterforce, remains a social scientific problem. I mean, it's not like it's outside of social history. But to get at that counterforce, you need to look at these kinds of bottom-up, intimate, small-scale forms of relationship. And I think that's as true today as it was then.
I see a sociologist with her hand up, so I'm going to call
I was
in.
so taken. First of all, it's very exciting that you try to ground this whole debate also in a social perspective, but in a different kind of social perspective, in terms of the relational dynamics, etc. I have one comment and one question. One comment relates back to the last question you posed in terms of how generalizable this framework is. And I wonder to what extent we can even historicize the model of collaborative authorship you're proposing with that in terms of the prior French academic tradition, which is kind of the master-student model of collaborative. But they also develop a common aesthetic, but it happens on very different grounds.
Yeah.
And then you have maybe the new era of technological collaborative authorship, where it's even human. This would be Bruno Latour, so it is something it was the Actons or something like this. So I wonder how much that's related to this question, how much we can generalize. And I will be curious to read your book from that angle to see if your work reveals some mechanisms in terms of what accounts for these inter-social dynamics, maybe even social psychology might be relevant here. And my question actually relates back to another comment that was given in terms of the studio, that they negotiate a common problem, yeah? And if we take that serious, that comment, then the question is, to what extent are these convergences in the aesthetic? To what extent do they represent a certain stage in a relationship? They negotiate a common problem, and once they've reached that, so that they can join and kind of heterodox aesthetic back at that time, so they needed to engage in this collaborative dynamic because they needed to create something that is distinctive and be courageous enough. Creativity and so is risk. But once they develop that, then comes the stage of individuation. Is there a certain chronology or temporal pattern to this convergence, divergence dynamic?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. So starting from the first, right? I mean, side-by-side painting goes on forever, and one of the main ways that it always goes on is in art classes. Where you have artists working together from the same model, but there is this hierarchical dimension. So you can see, the master pointing and giving advice about what is supposed to be done. And so why isn't this side-by-side painting in the way that I want to talk about it, or these? This leads to, I think, an interesting way of differentiating why the Impressionist model is specific, because when you have, in a more academic system, artists painting together, they'll take the sketches like this, and then each will pop it into his own painting. So here's one, Robert, and then the other option, is put him in a landscape like that. So there's this way in which you're dividing chronologically the stages from collaboration together, you're learning together, you're learning this very specific idiom where the works are not supposed to be very stylistically distinct. They're supposed to be sort of mastering the techniques that are held in common. And then you individuate yourself by virtue of how you put them into a finished product. Whereas with the Impressionist model, there's no prior institutional conferral of legitimacy. So if you go to art school, there's a conferral of legitimacy. And when you apply to exhibit your stuff, you say student of so-and-so. There's a way in which you are entering a tradition that has institutions of credentialization and legitimation, and that's how you distinguish yourself. The problem with an avant-garde is that there are none of those. It's completely unclear what it means to be a good Impressionist until there is an Impressionist movement that has a collective dynamic in which criteria of assessment can be formulated among the artists in relationship to dealers and collectors and so on. It's all tied to the rise of the art market, as you know.
Yeah, but what about the convergence and divergence?
Oh, yes. So this is the way that the developments of the core Impressionist artists are usually put, actually, is that they come together, they form this amazing thing, this group, codified group with a contract based on a baker's union, and they come together and they make this incredible accomplishment, and then they devolve into kind of interpersonal bitterness and hostility and jealousy, and they one by one quit and go off and do their own thing, and each one sort of sinks into a boring late style. It's not wrong, but I think the key thing that's missing there is that it's a process of formation, in the sense that it's not like there's a pre-existing Monet, right, meets a pre-existing Renoir. They work together a little bit, they learn from each other a little bit, and then they go, and then there's a continuing Monet and a continuing Renoir. It's that who each is at any particular moment is constituted in these kinds of social practices.
And this is pre-institutional recognition when the convergence is highest?
Yes.
Makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, Andre.
Hi, this is probably unfair because I haven't read the book yet, but we've been staring at these two side-by-side pictures so long that I was wondering how you deal with this in your thinking and in the book. Namely, we can all see it's the same island pictured from, I guess, Monet was a bit taller or standing a bit higher because the circular bit is a bit less elliptical, but so we see this amazing convergence, and I think you mentioned that Renoir doesn't usually pay attention to blue highlights in the water.
Yeah.
In that way. However, if you go back to the two Grenouilleres, most art historians would think the style makes the man, unfortunately shines through pretty clearly. For instance, the restaurant of Renoir is very fussy, and those little, right, yeah. You can, and you know, he loves dappled light on clothing, especially if it's patterned like stripes, right? So it seems some of it might be hand, some of it might be artists' gimmicks even. The trees, right, which have this three-dimensional effect on the left, on the right, and are much flatter. So I just wonder how you deal with this.
Yeah.
Almost these like rest values of the parts that don't overlap versus things like the water, where you see this amazing convergence of their eyes.
Well, that's what's so fun, is that you have both in the same pictures.
Right.
And that, you know, there are ways in which Renoir is trying out some Monet stuff in the water. There are also ways in which Monet is trying out some Renoir stuff. I mean, the genre of these pictures is a kind of interesting provocation. They're not landscapes, they're not genre scenes. One art historian called them humanscapes. That seems more kind of apropos.
It's a lot more extroverted than Monet usually is.
Yeah, exactly. Much more concerned with the sort of specifics of social dynamics seen at relatively close range. So the way that I look at these pictures is in terms of the question of what makes humans distinct from animals, really, or makes humans distinct from nature. This question of what is society to humans? You know, are we social creatures the way that ants are? Which Maupassant, describing Le Grand-Lière, described it as ants in an ant colony. Are we so incredibly special that our social relationships have nothing to do with our form of animal life? Neither of those seem right. And ultimately, I claim about these pictures that it has to do with sexuality and the relationship of men to women in the depicted pictures and men to men in the conditions of their making. But yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of holdover Renoir aspects and the holdover Monet aspects are what makes them so. It's why I love these particular ones. You know, it's, you know, in sort of Bloomian terms, Monet is usually the stronger painter. So you know, this is his first painting, so he's really trying to figure out what's going on, and so the Boudin like holds its own. And then again, you know, this is still a young guy trying to figure out what's going on. But it takes someone really good to paint next to Monet and not come off horribly.
Yeah, the boy on the walkway is wonderful. It's just so
Yes.
yeah, poetic. And I mean, if anyone tells you they can't draw, they're just doing paint blobs. You know, that's a good refutation.
And you see for sure the survival of caricature as a Monet idiom.
Well, so I have two, I'm not sure they're questions, just thoughts. Yeah, so I too was thinking about the studio, right, and painters painting side by side, and this moving from group to pair, and then I started thinking, why is it a duet and not a trio? I mean, why aren't there more out there? And you mentioned Bloom. I mean, how much of this is rivalry and, you know, not a broadly societal function, but two individuals duking it out? Because the comparison is art historically that I think of with those slides is, you know, Roth and Picasso in
Right.
1910.
Right.
So that's just a thought. I mean, why a trio, why a duet, not a trio or quartet? And then the other thought, which is going off in a different direction, is thinking about Monet painting side by side with himself. Right, the haystacks, and you've already anticipated this.
Yeah.
There it is. Okay, right. Okay. All right. That's, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that one has troubled me. The relation of seriality to the painting together, because you know, one could say something like, in seriality, Monet's trying to take on the whole the whole social function into himself or something, making himself completely self-sufficient, quasi-solipsistic, sometimes described as narcissistic. I don't think that's the case, because I think that the form of the paintings produced as series is consequence of this kind of collective formation. But there's definitely a kind of symmetry there, two people painting one thing, one person painting two things. The duet question, I think it's so tied to the worry about being an individual, that somehow being an individual in a crowd is harder than being an individual in a duet. And that somehow giving away part of your individuality alongside one intimate friend and one intimate encounter is somehow less threatening to the kinds of individuality that we valorize in liberal society, and that there's all kinds of worries are disappearing into a kind of conformism. Then the counter reaction against the kind of art studio model of everybody crowded around the same model, I think is part of that, right? Where as soon as you have this kind of crowding, semicircular format, the form of emulation and collectivity starts to take over somehow, I think.
Yeah.
And add to that, there is a quartet, and I feel like the book is built around a quartet plus Manet as the fifth. If I understand the structure of the book, it's that each of these, one is teacher, then there are different forms of collaboration. So it's not binary in that sense, and sometimes they were all four together. In fact, I think you have some pictures where they're all together in the same place. And it wasn't just the literal act of sitting and painting together, but maybe studio visits, being in the same studio, looking at each other's works. So I didn't feel the book relied too much on literally.
Yeah.
We're out here in the countryside. We've got our easels up there. Doing this, looking at your thing. That I don't think that's quite the model.
But it is really important to the rhetoric of what they're doing.
Yeah.
Martin.
Thanks, Harmon. Like one comment, I guess, and then one actual question. I mean, it struck me as you were talking there. I mean, there's a kind of interesting sort of analogy for the kind of dead life thing with like Mallarmé, right? And also your kind of sort of lateral relationality. I mean, in the sense of like Mallarmé wrote all these really amazing like tombola poems for like fellow writers that he felt had a kind of shared purpose with at some level, but like couldn't write one for his son, right? And like this attempt to like write a tombola for his child Anatole, it's like the greatest failure of his life, and kind of ended up really kind of consuming him. And it's interesting because there it's not. There isn't an equivalent to like the wall in the background, right? That, there's no wall there that is the kind of third thing, right? It's just enacted for him at the level of style, and then why that style that is the kind of axis of shared relationality can't then serve as a kind of acknowledgement, for or can't serve towards it, right? So that's just, it might be something interesting to think with. The second is really a question. I don't know how these paintings are made, but like I wanted to ask about like kind of like what the rules were, right? In the sense of like, are you allowed to take it back to your studio and like keep going, or like do you have to stop at the end of the day? Because there's something, there's this kind of like this kind of biblical sort of narrative behind it. You've got the sort of Adamic kind of like awakening, right? But then like you kind of fall into this kind of Babel world of like individual style, and like when does that happen? Why does it happen? Why does that commonality kind of fall away into the kind of thumbprint of like individual languages or something like that?
Yeah.
So I just wonder how that, just like how does the that kind of micro tragedy of the individual works get kind of worked out in kind of time and labor and all that.
Yeah, I love that, but there's so much to say. First, just about Mallarmé. I think no Mallarmé scholar, but the Mallarmé writes about Impressionism, and he focuses on this impersonality. He says a person going to the Impressionist exhibition would take all the works to be the product of a single man, and that man Monet. Which, if you look at the works in the Second Impressionist exhibition, is completely insane. Like, not at all. But there's something in there about this idea that quality, especially in a kind of avant-garde context, needs to come with a sovereign impersonality. I think that question of how you can have intimacy within impersonality is one of these kinds of tragedies of the modern form of intimacy.
Yeah.
The rules, there's only one story that I know of someone watching these guys do this, which is a story about Corot and Courbet painting together. And the guy who's reporting on it says that they do agree to use canvases of the same size and to start and stop at the same time. I think that was unique to those particular people, but it does highlight that this is a question, right? If there's a competitive dynamic to it, then you can see that for sure. The Impressionist rhetoric about the studio is so strict. We don't paint in the studio, we paint outside. It's kind of fake news. I mean, you can oftentimes point at aspects of the painted surface with this dry layer underneath and then something added on top. And often when you look at side-by-side paintings, the figures are different as the rest is constant. And often if you sort of lean in and look at the figures, they are overpainted. The figures were added later. But there's a kind of keeping each other honest dynamic about working together outside. That if the practice is so bound up with this claim of we are being faithful to the world before our eyes, there's a kind of corroborative aspect to it as well as collaborative.
I was also kind of wondering what you were saying too, like this idea of like time passing. Like obviously, like when you're painting, you have to start with the kind of main landscape, but like the difference between the two, like what kind of group of people would it draw to first to like sketch out first to go to, and how does that affect the kind of one moment? Because obviously the time is passing, but I was kind of wondering if your thoughts were like, because this is obviously like these moments are supposed to be capturing one thing, but actually it's a collection of things happening all the time.
Yeah, thank you. So speed is also really important to Impressionist rhetoric. The idea of instantaneity. They paint really quickly is the idea. You're supposed to be able to, throw something out the window and paint it before it hits the ground. Something that is sometimes said. And in the serial paintings, the ones, of the haystacks over and over, it's like painting the same thing at different times, this way of trying to acknowledge time. But I think what I'm hearing in your question is this sense of if two people are painting the same thing together and they have different kind of artistic priorities, then maybe they'll start in different places and end in different places. That's a really interesting point. I've never thought about that. Thank you.
You could see that in the dog, right? The dog is lying down in the Renoir and is being petted, perhaps, in the Monet. So it seems, as you said, as you pointed out, they picked moments that will not recur, and they froze those together with the more recurrent aspects of the scene.
Yes, and because the figures are often imagined, or at the very least, semi-imagined.
There were no women in bathing suits, you think?
Well, there were women in bathing suits. That's a key feature. But the figures then, I think, are able to serve more kind of compositional interest. So this chapter is about perspective. you know, one of the big claims about Impressionism usually is that they break perspective, you know, gets better and better and better from the Renaissance to Monet, and then, you know, it's over. But in their early paintings, the Impressionists are very interested in very literal, you know, geometric forms of perspective. My claim is that perspective at this moment goes from being something you make to something that you have. So we have ways of saying, you know, I have my perspective and you have yours. And this is registering not just like literal viewpoints on the same object, but a kind of whole world view, a whole life formation. But what's interesting here is that, oh no, there's this guy walking away, and he is at the vanishing point of the sidewalk. And if you kind of do the geometry of it, you see that it's pointing toward where Monet would have been, sitting. So there's a way in which this figure, if we're taking him to be, you know, imagined, becomes a kind of very strange displaced proxy for Monet as a way of acknowledging the sort of multiple framing and encapsulation and spatial relationality between the painters having this kind of deeper significance.
So it is 7 o'clock. I think the co-op wants us to adjourn. Thank you all for coming out, and go buy one of these books.